bring you up to speed with something that's happening today, which is that I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus. That's to say, a temperature and a persistent cough. And on the advice of the chief medical officer, I've taken a test that has come out positive. So I am working from home, I'm self-isolating, and that's entirely the right thing to do. But be in no doubt that I can continue, thanks to the wizardry of modern technology, to communicate with all my top team to lead the national fight back against coronavirus. And I want to thank everybody who's involved. I want to thank, of course, above all, our amazing NHS staff. It was very moving last night to join in that national clap for the NHS. But it's not just the NHS, it's our police, our social care workers, teachers, everybody who works in schools, the DWP staff, an amazing national effort by the public services, but also by every member of the British public who's volunteering. Incredible response. 600,000 people have volunteered to take part in a great national effort to protect people from the consequences of coronavirus. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody who's working to keep our country going through this epidemic. And we will get through it. And the way we're going to get through it is, of course, by applying the measures that you'll have heard so much about. And the more effectively we all comply with those measures, the faster our country will come through this epidemic and the faster we'll bounce back. So thank you to everybody who's doing what I'm doing, working from home to stop the spread of the virus from household to household. That's the way we're going to win. We're going to beat it, and we're going to beat it together. Stay at home, protect the NHS, and save lives.
So the Prime Minister giving the news there of his own positive test for coronavirus, saying that he developed a temperature and a cough, mild symptoms. Laura Kuenssberg. Laura, what have you got to tell us?
Good morning, Carrie. Well, I've just discovered that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has tested positive for coronavirus. He's understood to have mild symptoms. He will self-isolate in number 10 and will still be in charge of the government's approach to how they're handling the crisis. But obviously, this is a significant moment. Boris Johnson, of course, has been in close contact with the government's chief scientists and all the people who are in charge of trying to handle how the government's various responses are going. But he is now himself, having displayed mild symptoms, understood to have tested positive for the infection.
Laura, do you have more details of when that test was conducted, the nature of his symptoms and the date on which the test was conducted?
That's not yet clear, Carrie. We don't know that very much. I know that last week we reported that various members of staff in number 10 had already gone off with the virus, including David Frost, who is the government's lead Brexit negotiator, and various other people who'd been working in close contact with him. We asked the question at that point as whether or not the Prime Minister himself had been tested or whether there were concerns about his health. So I can't tell you at this point at what time he started to have the kinds of symptoms where they believed the right thing to do was to have a test. But we do know, as of now, he is said to be displaying mild symptoms and is well enough, essentially, to keep working using technology. So rather than, as I understand it, we've already seen those images, haven't we, of Boris Johnson sitting, holding plenty of video meetings. The Cabinet was already held using video links this week. So for now, he is not stepping back from the job that he's doing in terms of running the government's response. There is a kind of standby. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, is the person who would step up if the Prime Minister needed to take some time off work. But as of now, despite having the illness, Boris Johnson is still in charge of how the government is trying to fight this.
And Laura, this will raise questions about the conduct, the amount of social distancing around the Prime Minister and the point at which it was brought in, because we all saw him at those busy news conferences and in Parliament until only days ago.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this thing has sort of moved so quickly, but it's some time now since Nadine Dorries, who was a health minister, was confirmed to have had the disease. And at that point, that felt like a real sort of shock in Westminster. It's become quite clear since then that Westminster itself was the borough of Westminster, which is, of course, not just the sort of political village, has been seen to be one of the hotspots of the disease. And there have been various MPs who've been off self-isolating, various officials in Whitehall who've been off self-isolating. But until, I think, Thursday last week, the Prime Minister was appearing at a podium at a press conference, certainly much closer than 2 metres away from other very critical people to this effort, the government's chief scientist and the chief medical advisor for the whole country. But Downing Street had taken steps to change that in recent days. So press conferences, for example, haven't in the last few days been taking place online. But we do not have at this stage the sort of calendar of when he felt ill, when he therefore might have been aware that he could have been in a position to test positive. But as you suggest, there will be very close interest in those dates, and we may well find out more through the day.
Laura, we've just got up on screen, or let's bring it back up, the tweet from the Prime Minister himself. But while we're looking at that, could you just remind, for any viewers who are just joining us, of this very significant breaking news, obviously, for the governance, command and control of the entire COVID fight?
That's right. So just in the last few minutes, Carrie, we've learned, as people are just turning on, that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has tested positive for coronavirus himself. He's understood to only have mild symptoms. And for now, he will be self-isolating in number 10. And the plan is, at the moment, is for him to continue the job of trying to pull together the country's response to what is a genuine crisis, a health crisis and an economic crisis too. There are no plans, as things stand, for him to hand over the reins to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who has the official sort of number 2 role in this kind of situation if he were to become so ill that he was off. But for now, apart from using more technology to try to keep the Prime Minister sort of away from people who have not contracted the infection, he is trying to carry on, certainly not business as usual, but business as something like where he's still in charge. And now we know that he actually says he's only developed the symptoms over the last 24 hours. But of course, Downing Street is a place where there are lots of people going in and out all of the time. We know some of his key staff, the Brexit negotiator, for example, went off last week with symptoms. I understand there's various other important officials who have been off too, but the Prime Minister himself now has become the latest public figure to fall victim to this illness. Of course, the heir to the throne, of course, has also tested positive for coronavirus, which is clearly an infection that doesn't respect any boundaries. And clearly anybody at all could fall victim to this. But I would stress at the moment the Prime Minister says he has mild symptoms. There is no question at this point of something much more serious.
And Laura, a sensitive question about access to testing, because access to testing has been such a controversy over the past couple of weeks. And we saw on Wednesday when the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, tested positive, there were some questions from some figures in the NHS about what made him qualify for the test when many of those who are on the front line of the actual clinical fight against COVID-19 are not getting the testing that they are demanding. So I suppose here is the Prime Minister with mild symptoms and he has been tested.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that testing has become one of the key issues and one of the most controversial things about the government's handling of this. Were they prepared enough? Why does it appear that Britain is struggling to get the kinds of numbers of tests and the kind of programme of testing that other countries have had? I think while it's very understandable that there's real anxiety, particularly about medical staff not having access to tests, I think that most people would probably think that trying to track the Prime Minister's health at a time when the Prime Minister and the government are obviously under huge pressure, are trying to make sure that the country actually has a way through this crisis. I think most people would probably think it's kind of reasonable that people like him in Downing Street would have access to testing. But as you suggest, there is no question. Testing, or the lack thereof, is absolutely one of the pressure points of the government's handling of all of this, no doubt about that.
And Laura, I know you need to get on and make more calls around this. One last question to you, just on the subject of testing. Of course, until a few days ago, the policy was to test the individual who had symptoms, and then also to trace and test those with whom they've been in contact. And I'm sure all the Queen's subjects will be glad to have seen in the last few hours the photograph of herself in a telephone meeting with the Prime Minister in the light of these developments, rather than in a face-to-face for their regular meeting. But that question of the Prime Minister tracing, the Prime Minister now testing positive, the tracing of all those with whom he's been in contact, as you point out, many of them in very critical roles, that is going to be a concern.
Yes, I mean, if you think the lineup of the people who are in these vital meetings that go on in Downing Street trying to tackle the government's handling of this, of course, there's the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Advisor for the whole country, other senior cabinet ministers, the cabinet secretary who is in charge of making the Whitehall machine work at this time, the Chancellor, of course, who has been, ramping up these enormous changes to the financial system to try to stave off a very, very serious economic downturn. And of course, in Parliament this week, the Prime Minister was at Prime Minister's Questions just on Wednesday. Now, MPs were staying further apart from each other than they normally do. But, the Westminster is a very busy and bustling place full of people who carry out very important roles for the country. Like them or loathe them, it's somewhere where business is done that is vital to the whole country. Now, at the moment, it is comparatively deserted. It's a bit of a ghost town on the streets. But, of course, inside government departments, things are happening at a rate of knots and very frantically indeed. So, of course, this will be, a concern for a lot of people. Remember, Parliament itself closed early. They rose, to use the jargon, they rose early on Wednesday after emergency legislation had been passed. So Parliament itself is not sitting. But, behind the walls of Whitehall, even there might be hardly anybody in the street, there is work going on that is vital to all of us. And the Prime Minister, after the heir to the throne, is the second enormously significant person to have come down with the illness. I would stress, though, if people are just tuning in, at the moment what we know is that Boris Johnson developed symptoms in the last 24 hours. He was advised to have a test by the Chief Medical Officer. He has tested positive, but is displaying mild symptoms and is still trying to carry on with the job and will self-isolate in number 10 for now.
Laura, thanks so much for